Imagine spending more than $1 million to buy a restaurant. You hire the workers. You manage the schedules. You pay for food. You worry about wages, broken equipment, slow weekdays, customer complaints, and whether enough cars come through the drive-thru. If sales fall, you feel it. If labor gets more expensive, you feel it. If the restaurant needs new equipment, you may be writing the check. And then every month, money leaves your restaurant and goes back to McDonald's. Not just because you use the name. Not just as a royalty. Rent. Which creates a strange question. If this is supposedly your McDonald's, why are you paying McDonald's to occupy it? The answer reveals something much more interesting than the old claim that McDonald's is secretly a real estate company. Because when someone says they own a McDonald's, ownership does not mean what most people assume. The franchisee can own the restaurant business. McDonald's can still control the brand, the operating system, the franchise agreement, and in many conventional franchises, the property underneath the restaurant. So the real question is not simply, who owns the McDonald's? It is, who owns which layer of economics? And who gets paid before anyone knows what the owner actually keeps? What does it actually cost to own a McDonald's? The first surprise appears before you sell a single Big Mac. In the United States, McDonald's currently says candidates are typically expected to have at least $750,000 in non-borrowed, unencumbered personal funds. It also recommends roughly $100,000 in working capital per restaurant, plus additional funds for relocation. And that is not the purchase price. That is the financial strength McDonald's wants to see before you are even placed into the system. The restaurant itself can require an investment well into 7 figures depending on the location, acquisition terms, and format. A traditional U.S. franchise also generally includes an initial franchise fee of about $45,000. Then there is training. McDonald's says candidates generally spend around 6 to 12 months learning the system before purchasing a restaurant. But here is the first thing that changes what buying a McDonald's actually means. You are not usually buying a piece of land, building your own restaurant, and simply licensing the golden arches. McDonald's separates franchisee selection from site development. It can secure the location, develop the restaurant, and then place an operator into that system. So you may invest heavily in a McDonald's without owning the most obvious physical asset underneath it, the land. And that is where the rent begins to make sense. The restaurant you own, but the property you don't. McDonald's uses several franchise structures around the world, so not every restaurant works exactly the same way. But in its conventional franchise model, McDonald's generally owns the land and building or secures a long-term lease on them. The franchisee invests in the operating business and typically pays for things such as equipment, signs, seating, and decor. Think about that arrangement. You can invest more than $1 million. You can employ everyone working inside the restaurant. You can manage the entire operation. But McDonald's may still control the location itself. And the contract reflects that. A conventional franchise arrangement can effectively create 2 relationships. The first is a license. That gives you the right to operate using McDonald's brand and system. The second is a lease. That gives you the right to occupy the restaurant. So McDonald's can be 2 things at once. Your franchisor and your landlord. These relationships commonly run for roughly 20 years. And if the operator eventually leaves, the location does not necessarily leave McDonald's with them. McDonald's can keep control of the underlying site and potentially place another operator into the restaurant. That makes the property more than just an investment. It becomes part of McDonald's control over the entire franchise system. The operator can change. The golden arches can stay. Follow $100 through a McDonald's. Now, let's follow the money. Imagine one franchise McDonald's generates exactly $100 in sales. This is only an illustrative example. There is no universal McDonald's franchise profit margin. Labor, food, rent, debt, and operating costs vary dramatically between restaurants. But the example shows how the structure works. Start with food and packaging, then labor. For perspective, McDonald's own company-operated restaurants spent roughly 31% of sales on food and paper in 2025, and roughly 30% on payroll and employee benefits. Those are corporate store figures, not franchisee averages. But use similar numbers for our illustration. From $100, take $31 for food and packaging, Take another $30 for labor. Already, we are down to $39. Now McDonald's enters the waterfall. Depending on the agreement, a U.S. franchisee may pay an ongoing service royalty of roughly 4% to 5% of gross sales, with newer agreements generally using the higher rate. Use 5%. Another $5 disappears. Advertising and marketing obligations can consume around another 4% of sales. Take $4. Now we are at $30. And we still have not paid the rent. McDonald's rent is not one universal percentage. It varies by property, investment and agreement, and conventional arrangements can include minimum rent plus amounts tied to restaurant sales. So for this example only, suppose rent consumes another $10. Our original $100 has now become $20. But the restaurant still has bills, utilities, insurance, repairs, maintenance, cleaning, technology, local fees, management, debt payments, taxes, and eventually reinvestment. Suppose those remaining expenses take another $10. Only $10 remains. Again, that is not a claim that McDonald's franchisees earn a 10% margin. A different labor market, rent agreement, debt structure, or sales volume could produce a completely different result. The important part is the order of the waterfall. McDonald's calculates important payments from a restaurant's sales. The franchisee discovers their profit only after nearly everything else has been paid. That distinction explains the entire model. The number that makes the rent click. Now we reach the number that changes how you see McDonald's. In 2025, McDonald's reported approximately $16.55 billion in revenue from franchise restaurants. About $6.02 billion came from royalties. And rent? $10.442 billion. That means McDonald's generated roughly $4.4 billion more in franchise rent than in franchise royalties. That is not a side business. That is not a small contractual detail. Rent is one of the largest engines inside McDonald's economics. Most people imagine franchising like this. Someone pays McDonald's for the logo. They sell burgers. McDonald's takes a percentage. But McDonald's can monetize two different assets at once: the brand through royalties and the location through rent. There is another comparison that shows just how large this has become. McDonald's company-operated restaurants generated about $9.7 billion in restaurant sales during 2025. Rental revenue from franchise restaurants alone was about $10.4 billion. Those are not directly comparable measures of profitability. One is restaurant sales. The other is rental revenue. But the scale is remarkable. McDonald's still has property costs of its own. In 2025, it recorded roughly $2.6 billion of franchised restaurant occupancy expense, including lease and depreciation-related costs. So this is not free money. But franchise restaurants still generated approximately 90% of McDonald's restaurant margin dollars. And that is why saying McDonald's is really just a real estate company is too simplistic. The power comes from combining several businesses: brand plus property, royalty plus rent, restaurant system plus landlord. That combination is much more powerful than real estate alone. Two businesses inside the same restaurant. Now imagine sales at one franchise fall 10%. For the operator, the pain can arrive quickly. Employees still need to be paid. Equipment still breaks. Insurance still renews. Debt payments still arrive. And minimum occupancy obligations do not simply disappear because Tuesday was slow. That is the franchisee's exposure. Their risk is concentrated in a small number of restaurants. A road closure matters. A new competitor matters. Poor management matters. Food inflation matters. Labor costs matter. McDonald's carries risk too. If restaurant sales weaken, royalties and percentage rent weaken. McDonald's has enormous property commitments. It faces consumer shifts, brand damage, strategic mistakes, and the possibility that franchisees themselves become financially unhealthy. But the exposures are different. At mid-2026, McDonald's had more than 46,000 restaurants worldwide, with well over 44,000 franchised. So one franchisee can have a disastrous year because one location struggled. McDonald's participates economically across tens of thousands of locations. Same burgers. Same customers. Very different financial game. Then why would anyone become a franchisee? At this point, the arrangement might sound almost unfair. Invest heavily. Run the restaurant. Take much of the operating risk. Then pay McDonald's royalties and rent. So why do operators voluntarily sign up? Because they are not paying for nothing. Imagine opening an independent burger restaurant tomorrow. You need a brand, a menu, suppliers, training systems, technology, marketing, site selection expertise, food safety procedures, operating standards. And after spending all that money, you still need to convince customers to walk through the door. A McDonald's franchise buys access to a machine where most of those systems already exist. The brand already has demand. The supply network already operates at enormous scale. The menu already has recognition. National marketing already exists. And the operating playbook has been refined across thousands of restaurants. That has enormous value. It also explains why successful operators often expand beyond one location. McDonald's says more than 90% of its U.S. franchise owners operate at least 2 restaurants. So this is not a story where McDonald's automatically wins and the franchisee loses. If operators consistently cannot make money, McDonald's would eventually damage its own system. The relationship only works if successful franchisees can build valuable businesses too. The interesting part is that each side creates and captures value differently. The bigger McDonald's machine. Now zoom out. Why does McDonald's not simply operate every restaurant itself? Because then it would also have to absorb far more of what franchisees currently handle. More employees, more local management, more restaurant-level capital, more operating volatility, more equipment investment, more execution risk. Franchising changes that equation. The franchisee contributes capital and operating effort. McDonald's contributes the brand, systems, development expertise, and in conventional franchises, often the property platform. Then both sides make money from the same restaurant through different channels. In 2025, franchise McDonald's restaurants generated roughly $130 billion in sales worldwide. McDonald's did not record all of that as corporate revenue because those restaurants belong to franchise operators. Instead, those enormous system-wide sales became the economic base supporting royalties, rent, and franchise-related revenue. That is the machine. Franchisees operate restaurants. Customers create the sales. McDonald's owns the brand and systems surrounding those sales. And multiple claims sit on top of the same hamburger. So, what do you actually own? Now return to the original question. If you own a McDonald's, why are you paying McDonald's rent? Because you do not necessarily own every asset that makes that restaurant valuable. You may own the operating business. You employ the staff. You manage the restaurant. You invest capital. You take significant day-to-day operating risk. And if the location performs well, that business can become extremely valuable. But above the operating business sits another layer. McDonald's owns the brand. McDonald's controls the standards. McDonald's controls the franchise relationship. And in a conventional franchise, McDonald's often owns or controls the property too. Which means there are really 2 definitions of ownership sitting inside the same restaurant. The franchisee asks, after food, labor, royalties, rent, advertising, repairs, debt, and taxes, what do I have left? McDonald's asks a different question. How much did the restaurant sell? Because several of its most important payments are connected to that number before the operator knows what remains at the bottom. And that is the deeper economics of owning a McDonald's. The franchisee owns the responsibility of making the restaurant work. McDonald's owns something different. The system the restaurant has to work inside. And once you understand that distinction, paying McDonald's rent no longer looks strange. It looks like one of the central reasons the McDonald's machine became so powerful.